So I wanted to talk through this project a bit because I think the video I showed was really quick and people have asked for a slowed down version, but I think it's just easier if I explain what I did rather than posting the slowed down. So this is the renders. These were the final things in the end. This is after a bit of touching up in Photoshop. Um, yeah, I mean this project actually took me 2 days to complete, from like literally start to finish. And I'm quite happy with the result, but I can talk you now through the steps of like how this was done. So let's go to the video. Yeah, this is the final outcome, like I just showed you guys, and the first thing I did was work in Daz to develop the avatar. I use Daz for a few reasons, but it's just quite easy to generate a nice human shape and to work in quite a procedural way with the sliders. I had a reference board that was visible on the right side, so I'll show you the reference board. This has references for the dress in question, the coat, and the bodysuit underneath. So I found these pictures of just the bodysuit and the coat, and then obviously these images of the padded dress. These were for a second project I worked on, but it was good for proportion and for the shape of the body, but then these Polaroids were kind of what I used in Daz to get a shape, like just a basic proportion. I just wanted the kind of same length and width of the body. So I'll show you quickly the Daz Studio file. This is in PureRef, by the way. If you don't work with PureRef already, it's quite nice because you can just drop images in and set, you can move this board around, and yeah, it's quite nice to work with. I'm just gonna minimize this and show you the Daz project. So I think in the video you can see I started off with a character called Sahil, I think. And this is just basically making the pose now. And the basic shape. So I started with a base character, I imported her, and then I go through these kind of body morph options for either the full body or the entire actor or just the body. So like for example, these ones are for the entire actor. So if I change these, the head shape will change as well. But if I change these ones, these are just for the body. So the head will stay the same and the body will change. So it's quite nice to be able to add height, weight, details around the body if you want it to look in a certain way. I've got all these presets, so I just use them as sliders and they change the body proportion. So that's how I generated this, and then I just used the basic like posing function inside Daz to just get the pose right. But I worked from a preset, so I'd like find a pose that is somewhere near that exists in a preset that I've already got, either for the legs or for the arms, and then just work around that using, the joint controls here. So if I click a joint, I can use this ball to like roll the joint around and change how the arm is moving, for example. So that was setting up Daz, and then the output of this process basically is just avatars. So in the end of this, I've posed the avatar, I've made the shape, I've made the stance. There's a few things I need to work with, which is the pose. Like this was the pose I was working with. Okay, now we're in close. I'll come back to this. That was the pose I was working with as she was stood in this reference here. So like this was how I wanted her to stand in my render in the end, with like a hip out of the dress so we could see all the bodysuit, and then with one leg underneath the dress so that we could, like see the shape of the padding. So that was the pose I got to here with the hip out and one leg kind of pushed underneath. And then from here, I would export a series of avatars. So the first one would be T-pose. Like I would save this pose file and then I'd export a T-pose avatar like this to work around, to quickly simulate the garments surrounding Clo. And then I would export the posed file. So again, this is how she stood in the image, the reference. And then this is like an A pose where her feet are together and her arms are down, so it's not as extreme as the T pose, but it's nice to have an in between to work with sometimes, especially when you're working with these padded garments. And then I would bring these avatars into Clo. So I'd start off with the T pose. So as you see here, I'm working with a basic dress pattern. So I first want to generate this corset, and then I wanted to make the bodysuit underneath, and both of them come from the same resource, which is this base garment, which is a dress block. So it has 2 front darts and 2 back darts and 2 bust darts on the front, and there's a little bit of shaping in the shoulder to make it sit nicely on the back, but this is just a really basic block. And what I start to do here is just add in the style lines of this corset to visualize the size of the corset, and then I cut away all the rest of the pieces. So I've got an example of how the corset was in the end. So in T-pose, this was like my bodysuit and corset all together. So like this was the corset, and then these pieces here are like the boning and edge binding details. They've got like a higher thickness value applied to them than the base pieces, so that I get some kind of thickness and shadows in the construction of this, kind of like it is in this reference. If I look back at it here, you see there's thickness on top, and then there's a bit of like draping of the satin. This right now is really flat, but I just wanted this as the basis, and then later on I'll add some wrinkles. But for now, this all came from the dress block. So for the pants, I just drew like 2 leg shapes and then fitted this around the avatar and get this skin tight look, basically. The hardest thing to do, I guess you'll see in the video, is finishing the bust line of the suit underneath to make this sit within the bust. So now I'm just shaping this corset in really close to the body. I'm adding the same shape seams as I can see in the reference here. I'm trying to replicate those shapes, and then adding thickness to add the bone channels underneath. So it's just working, you know, to first create the shape, then create the seam details, then create the edge details of each seam, of each piece of boning, and then adding all this thickness and starting to merge things together. So in this way, again, I'm starting from the dress block. So I bring the dress block back into the scene, and I've saved out my corset, and now I'll start to work on the dress on this kind of catsuit thing underneath. So I'll draw the cup shapes in using the internal line tools in Clo3d. So again, working with a basic dress block that's fitted correctly around the waist and the hip and across the bust, I start to draw in these style lines and use those to kind of build the architecture of this piece underneath. So I've cut away the sides already, and then I've added like extra length through the crotch to make this fit like a swimsuit. And then I'm now adding darts and shaping into the waist and the hips to make this really fit close to the body, making the neckline, but still this central bone doesn't sit between the bust yet. It kind of sits away because of how it fits. So what you see me do now is kind of find a way to stitch this down and get this kind of cup appearance. So now you see it looks like cups, and if I go into the Clo3d file, you'll see what I mean. So these 2 pieces sit against the chest. They don't sit across the top of the body here. They don't go from bust to bust, they go between. So that was really having to shape the cups in and then make these 2 front pieces stay flat against the chest when you're simulating the rest of the garment. So that's a tip of dealing with cups when you're making a corset. And then it was to add the leg pieces in, having enough shape, you know, having enough fabric to get a good simulation around the thigh and around the calf without anything being too tight, and then finalizing the details around the cup and the corset. So that was kind of the first Clo3d file that I set up. I quickly added some materials here just for visual purposes, but I did all the texturing in Blender in the end, so this was just to visually see. And then here I've now changed pose into the standing pose. So that's why I have these 3 avatars, so I can transition inside Clo3d using the morph target function to go from one pose to the next. And then again making some changes because we've had to simulate, so just fitting the chest in again, freezing some layers while they simulate, and then redrawing the cup shapes. And then this was fitted nicely to start simulating the cut around. But just really looking at the reference, adding thicknesses here, adding wrinkles into the fabric around the the corset to make that look more natural, like in the reference, because there's some wrinkles, so I could add that in the geometry in Clo. And then just finalizing the top edge of this bodysuit to make a really nice finish on the end. Then I went in to start developing the coat, which was the trickiest part of this process. I'll show you where I kind of start from with this. So before the padding happens, I have this very basic shape, but it's all based around the corset. So it's the same corset I had before, but just a little bit bigger, because here you see this corset that holds this coat together is the same corset shape that's underneath. They've really used the same logic of how this is constructed around the waist for both garments, and even if I look kind of here, again you can see it's the same width from the bottom of here down. So this is what I used as a basis. I took this garment as a basis and then added in the shell, and the shell looks like this. This was the shell of the draped the flared dress panels on the bottom. So there's 6 panels all the way around with a kind of train in the back, because it's a very long dress, and then a front and back kind of kimono sleeve construction attached to the top of the corset, and then I've added the collar in as well. And as well, I've added in this band all the way down the front. So here there is a band that runs all down the front edges on both sides to kind of give the garment some support, which is also how the garment is made in the reference. So that is creating the basis of the dress. The tricky part was getting the padding right, because there was more than one way to approach this, and it took me a few trials to get this right. So the first step was to basically drape the coat in the correct pose. Before you saw like it was not, the jacket was closed and it wasn't draped in this way, but now this is how I want it to hang around the body. Like when I look in these references, this is how her leg, is kind of posed out of the dress. And then it was a case of starting to add the thickness, and initially I was using kind of one pattern piece for each area. So you see here it's like one pattern piece here, and one here, and the idea was to add then the seam lines like this. This is where each of the sections of the dress will go, and then to simulate that with one piece of fabric. But if you look here, when I keep it as one piece of fabric, I can't get a good definition in the top. Like it looks okay in the hemline, and then the way the grain of this fabric is working, I can't get the thickness to really pop out here. And if when I look at the reference image, there's really an impression between each like level. There's like a bump each way down. There's a lot of thickness, and there's even a seam running up the side here. It's quite discreet, this seam. It's well done and it's well placed, but it's still there. And then the thickness is running around the edge of this as well. So this is quite architecturally done. And if you then look inside, the inside is actually quite flat comparatively. Like this piece on the inside here doesn't have the same thickness as it does here, the same ridge. It's just, we see an impression, but we don't see the same thickness. Whereas here we see an extreme amount of thickness. So the idea for me was then to kind of go backwards and look at how I could change this approach to get more thickness like I'm getting in the bottom here. So this was what I kind of drew out. So you see here I was working with 2 pattern pieces, but I couldn't get the definition in the top. Even when I added additional shrinkage, well, I expanded the fabric by about 120%. It worked in the bottom, but I'm not getting the correct look in the top. So I wanted to cut each of these pieces, like create a seam where these green lines are, and remove this essential seam here. So these would be blended into one piece, quite like it is in this reference here. Like this is a blended point here. Basically they've overlapped these pattern pieces and created a seam that's been pressed flat. And here I would do the same. I would merge this seam, make it as flat as possible, and then for these each one would be its own pattern piece in order to create sections and to create thickness this way rather than thickness vertically. I want to create it round. So that got me to something that started to look more like this, I guess. You can see a lot more of the thickness between each level, and this seam is completely gone down here now. Like I've merged these seams away, and the skirt is starting to look correct. But if I go back to the video, you'll see there's a lot of back and forth. Like this takes a while to achieve, and there's a lot of trial and error, and a lot of frustration, I must admit, when you're working on padded garments, because there can be a lot of collision issues. So it takes quite a skill at a certain point to get this working. I'm refitting the top of the dress here to make it shorter and to raise the floor, and then again working on getting this padding right to make it look like this reference on the side. So the whole time I'm doing this padding, I've actually got this reference on the left side of the screen. You see, like I'm looking at these images the whole time just to get how this is looking as a structure. I'm not interested in materials or anything like that yet. I'm just trying to get this looking right in terms of the shape. So eventually, yeah, eventually the whole thing is finished and I start to go into Blender. So when it's finished, it looks something like this. If I actually, maybe not. So this is the final Clo model in the end. This is what it looks like. This is how I got the skirt to sit. This was the back, the side, and the front. No boots at this point. That all happens in Blender, but right now this was where I wanted to get. I wanted the thickness of the skirt, the thickness around the arms, the collar, the corset's all done, and I've got some nice little wrinkle details all around here from the corset construction. So this is the level of detail I want to get to inside Clo, and then I'm going to take this all into Blender, which was the next part of the video. So if I go now into the Blender file, I'll show you how this is kind of set up. What you'll see is just basically the import process. I quickly import the files, the avatar, the clothing, set a camera, set a light, and just start to build a very basic material to just identify everything at this point. I didn't want the avatar to take any focus, so I just blacked out the material in the avatar, and she's eventually just not visible. She's just a silhouette. And then it's moving on to creating the satin fabric, the material for the dress. This is probably the more complex part of this, and I can kind of show you how this looks inside Blender. So I've cleaned this up since I made this originally, but I can go into render view here and you'll see how this material looks. If I jump out of camera, this is basically the scene. So it's 3 mirrors, metallic panels, mirrors. They're kind of not very reflective, but yes, they're mirrors. There's a logo placed on the floor which is glowing, which has light emission from it, and then the material is set up like a satin shader, and it uses like a twill and a grain. There's a blend that's happening here, so I can explain how this is done. This isn't to teach you texturing, this is just to show you how I did it, and then in other videos I can explain much more in detail how this texturing system works. But basically, if I look here and I turn this to image editor, yes, okay, so this is a texture map that I'm using as a roughness map. So this is the roughness texture here. This is the tiling. It has a 15. I've tiled this like 15 times each way. It's going through a color ramp to kind of flatten out some of the values, and then this is being fed into my principal BSDF, and then that's being used as a roughness channel. So that's part of the way that this roughness is being created. It's also being fed as a roughness map into a glass BSDF shader with a pink color applied to it. So there's a roughness map being put in, there's a pink applied. I have this IOR value of glass, and I'm feeding this into a mix shader. I'm doing this to get this type of satin reflection. This is one way to do this, but if I just use the BSDF shader, if I just plug this in, the fabric looks different. It still looks like satin, but it's not giving the same finish. But if I blend this with a glass shader, I can get this like extra layer of reflection and this extra color I can input into it to make this feel a little bit more purple. It's a very subtle difference. And if I push this up, you'll see how this purple, this really looks like this glass, what this is doing. But it's giving this layer on the top that feels a little bit metallic and a little bit more like satin. It's making the fabric act a little bit more in the way of this reference image. So I then have a slider of how much I can cause this effect to happen. So if I slide this all the way to 0, it's just the fabric shader. If I slide this all the way to 1, I've mixed a lot of this in. So this is at 0.4, and that's how I kind of blend two shaders together. But then going mainly into here, what I'm using is the normal input, and everything else is kind of left alone. For the roughness, I push the isotropic to 1, because if it's all the way down, this is what the roughness looks like, and I want it to look like this. And the rotation just changes literally the rotation of the reflection. So you can experiment with these two things, but to get a satin looking fabric, push this anisotropic all the way up, and then experiment with the rotational value as well. I've got this set to 1 and 0.91 to get this satin effect. But the main thing is the normal map. So I have 3 normal maps here. 1, 2, and 3. So the first one is like a wrinkle. So if I zoom in on this, it's just like a fabric wrinkle kind of bump. This one is a fabric weave structure, like a twill. If I zoom really far in, you should be able to see this kind of twill structure, this grain of fabric happening. And if I go here, I have another kind of bumpy effect. So this is more like to add surface detail into the structure rather than the actual micro detail of the fabric. And each one of these has its own mapping. So these mappings set the tiling. So if I just look maybe at this one, this one. So this is my twill grain basically, and if I want to change the size of this, I could change this to 6, and now I've got a thicker grain of fabric. This just gives me like a control of like how much twill grain I'm basically producing, so that's 12. And it's the same here. So if I look at this bump that I've added in, it's kind of adding this wrinkled effect all over the fabric. So again, I can control this by using these mapping values here to just change how big these wrinkles are, but it's just going to give the whole thing a bit more real feel of the fabric, like in the reference. Because if we look at the reference image, if I go back, there's a lot of wrinkles and bumps and kind of puckering that's happening. As much as it's this beautiful satin, we do want to see this type of imperfection to feel that realism. We see a bit of the padding, a bit of the shadows. We want to bring that in. That's how we do that in Blender. So I'll hide this away again. That's how that map is working. And then this one is the kind of creases. So there's some little puckered creases like going down the grain of the fabric here if I zoom in a bit. So again, this has its own mapping control, so I can change the size of these creases as well if I change these values. I'll leave them as they are for now. And then I basically blend them together using 2 darken nodes. So I put 2 normal maps into one darken, so the outcome of that is, it's not necessarily entirely visible unless you know what you're looking for, but you see the wrinkle of the fabric that I've added in on one, and then you see the twill of the fabric that I've added on the other. And then I blend that with the other bump. So when I look at this one, I've kind of got bumps, wrinkles, creases, twill lines, all just added in by blending together these normal maps. So this is what the normal map input is. This isn't what a normal map looks like. This is what Blender is kind of using the data for. The normal map themselves look like this. These are the normal maps using the correct like RGB values. And then this is all fed into my shader here. So that is how I'm creating a lot of the surface detail of this fabric, is just by using 2 mix nodes and mixing together 3 different normal maps with their own mapping coordinates so that I can use each one each one has a separate control of how big that is. So again, if I go to the twill and I put 6 here, you'll be able to see a lot more the definition of that twill. If I put 3, it'll be really, really big. But I want to be able to control that and go down to 12 so that it's affecting the light and the surface, but I'm not seeing this from far away. It's how we're getting the realistic effect of this fabric. The next thing to look at would be how I set this scene up. So what you basically see is 3 panels, 1, 2, 3, and they all have just a different material setting. So for these 2 wall panels, the material has got a glossy mixed with the principled shader. So again, I have this roughness value that I can move up and down, and the further down I go, like these are completely reflective mirrors now. So you can see these spherical lights which I put in the scene. You can even see in the background here, this is the reflection of the, you know, the avatar at the dress. I'm going to put this roughness value back to where it was, 0.28. So these are kind of like frosted glass now almost. And they're just bouncing around the lights that I've added in the scene. So that's how these 2 materials are set up. And for this guy on the floor, he's a bit more complicated. It's the same glossy value, mixed value into the surface when I've built this shader, but the principal node has got a lot more being added into it, and it's all coming from this guy right here. So if I go to image editor, this image is this logo on the floor basically, right? So this image texture is this. I just made a logo. It's placed in quite some space around it, but this is the logo placed on position on the floor. These coordinates I've used to kind of map this onto this plane. So now it's just being projected onto the plane, and I could use this to like if I change this value, it will move around on the floor. So that's how I've kind of positioned this, is using the location, rotation, and scale coordinates of the mapping node to input the position of this at like kind of directly under the avatar. So that's the Medusa logo that's been input, and then it's been split out into different areas. So one is into a color ramp to add a base color, one is into a color ramp to add a metallic value, one is into a color ramp to add into the roughness value, and then one is to go into another color ramp to go into the emission. So if I unplug this and I unplug the base color, this is quite literally just I can change the color of this whole mirror, and these metallic and roughness values are what are affecting this the look of this. So if I unplug the metallic, we've just got a roughness value applied in there now, so I can just about see it. But layering together these different channels makes this pop out. It makes this visible, but it's still kind of like reflecting in the material, you know, like it's inside the surface of this mirror. The emission is what is making this light up. So in this emission slot here, if I just put like white, like the whole thing turns into a light. And that's not what we want. We want something to be fed into there that is black and a color, because black is no emission, and then anything that is not black will start to emit light. So black will basically mask out all the light, and then white, the red, is what will project the color. So that's what I'm kind of doing with these, is splitting them up to kind of create different values with these ramps that are useful for what I want to do here. So the base color of this mirror is actually pink, but I've also got this blue mixed shader on top of it. This glossy blue is being mixed on top of this. Into the metallic, there's this like there's more metal information in the darker the color is, so there's more metallic in the gray area than there is in the white area. And the same here for the roughness. There's more roughness, there's less rust in the dark area, so it will be shinier than there is in the lighter area. So here, the black is no emission, the red is being emitted. So when I plug the emission into this port here, and I look at the shader, this is now projecting light. I could push this strength really high up, and it would kind of start to bleach out a bit. It'll become white, but you'll see a lot more like how this light is being bounced off the jacket and the coat and everything. So I'll put that back to where it was. So there's just a little bit of light being projected out of this. But then I blend this with the glossy. So if I just look at the glossy, it's this blue gloss that goes over the top of everything. And if I then blend that a little bit with the shader, you know, I could have a lot of blue gloss or I could have very little. And I had this set to, I think, 0.28 as a default. And that just allows this to catch blue light. So that's how I'm bringing some extra blue light into the scene, is by having these wall panels all set with this blue glossy to add this blue reflection into the scene. The last thing to look at is the light. So if I go into the 3D viewport here, this is one big light right here. It's about 1,000 watts. It's a 4-meter radius and it's set to a blue color. So if I turn this off, a lot of the blue is going to come out of the scene, but it's not overpowering, but it's kind of added into the background. So if you look here at this big blue spot in the background, that is coming from this light. The same goes for some of these other ones. So this is set to a really kind of gray blue, 1,000 watt, 0.1, but this is kind of positioned right above the avatar, kind of high up, to pour some light down into the scene. This one is doing quite a lot, which is actually a pink light, and this one is actually set underneath. Maybe that's not being used very much. But there's just a few lights positioned in this to kind of bounce around in the background and kind of cast off each of these mirrors in order to like this one is red, so if you look here you can see that red light there. So if I turn this off, it disappears from the reflection, but it kind of comes back in, so that when I'm in the camera mode, like I'm in the view, I see these nice little lights reflecting around. Same from this view, it's adding something into the background as well. So it's not just about lighting the garment. This was kind of about where to place them in the 3D space to kind of bounce around with these mirrors. But I think this starts to create quite a nice look. You know, you get the light reflecting from the floor, you get the light reflecting off these mirrors. You can see here the wrinkles. I think I might have changed the setting a bit, but you can see all the wrinkles being projected like I tried to set up in the fabric. So yeah, that was the intended effect here. You know, we want to see puckering, we want to see wrinkling, we want to make this feel more natural. And you can really see that now in the render from this angle with this light pouring down in this direction. The avatar is just set to complete black and complete metal with no roughness. So if I push this roughness up, and maybe, yeah, she's just set to completely black. So if I turn this to white, we'll see like this reflective avatar. I wanted to take her just completely out because as much as it's kind of cool to identify like these human characteristics, I didn't want them to be distracting. So I just set the base color to completely black, and now she's like a shadow, a nice silhouette. I set a few cameras. They have depth of field attached to them, to kind of blur out a bit of the background. And then I worked quickly in Photoshop to just push some of the final tones of blue, basically. I can show you that in Photoshop. So if I look at this render in Photoshop, for example, like this is where we were in Blender. This is the render I get out within the end. A lot of this noise in the background that you see here is gone in my final render. I can't remember it. This one. So this is then what I would take into Photoshop, and if you look at the renders in the end, the render in here, I've kind of changed the tone of the blue and I've added some noise back in so it feels like a bit of a film grain. But that's just choices in kind of my color correction in the end. So there is noise in this, but this is actually added back in. This isn't from the render, which sounds weird, but it is to make the camera feel more authentic is the reason why I do it. So this is like Photoshop. This is what I've got here, and then like I said, the render in the end is looking more like this. I would quickly like work with just this layer stack here. So like add a curves. For example, first look at the blue curve and then see if you just add a little bit of blue in this to make this feel like a more blue than green. If I take it away, it'll go green. If I push a bit in, it'll go blue. I can change the direction of this curve a bit, you know, to change that intensity. I could then add levels, for example, on top of that, and, you know, make this feel a little bit darker in the shadows, for example, and push a bit of contrast into it. Could then click here again and add exposure. Do we have? Yes. Push the offset up a little bit to kind of make this grayness come through. Bring the exposure down, push it up, just see which way it feels nice. Take it down a bit. The gamma correction, you know, I wanted to wash this out a bit, and then I can really bring this, if I use the opacity slider here on the exposure, I can like fade this out. So I can change like how intense this exposure channel is being used, and I can do that for the rest as well. And then for the noise, I kind of just choose this bottom layer, right and click the layer, duplicate, and then go to filter, noise, add noise. And you might want to zoom in a little bit to see how this is working. But if I turn off preview, you'll see the difference. Push the amount up a little bit because we're going to, again, you know, control this. You can use uniform or Gaussian, it's up to you. I'll turn off monochromic. And this is with a bit of grain added back into it. And again, you can use this opacity slider to remove this grain if you want. But that will start to get us look somewhere, you know, closer to this. In the end, I think I've done a bit more correction of the red value. So if I go to the curves here, then go to red, I could push the red up a little bit, you see, take it out of some areas, push it into other areas. So, you know, experiment with how these work, and then, you know, experiment with the intensity so I can bring that down a bit. But that is, you know, just a quick way to start to touch this up in Photoshop, just in terms of the colors. But I always bring it into Photoshop to color correct it in the end, because if I just look now between here, which was my render out of Blender, and then here, this feels a lot nicer. So, you know, it depends where you want to stop. Maybe this was better. But, you know, experiment with Photoshop, experiment with compositing in Blender, but that's how I get the final result. And yeah, I think that would sum up everything that I did in this video from start to finish. The only thing is I added the boot at the end. I exported that from Daz, brought that into Blender. Here's what I was kind of describing of setting the layers in Photoshop in the end to do the color correction, and yeah, producing the final renders. So yeah, I hope that helps you guys in some way figure out how I did this project. A lot of the detail was added in Blender. A lot of the detail in the geometry was done in Clo. So yeah, good luck, and let me know in the comments if you guys have more questions. I'm happy to answer.